Hey guys, I literally just had to run upstairs to record this video because it was just such a good idea and I needed to do it now. So Quadrivium Supplies is a retailer based in Chicago, and she makes ritual oils and other magical things. And on Twitter, she posted like, hey, like witchy and magical Twitter, what are some things about practice that like seem really obvious but you didn't know and you were too embarrassed to ask about. And I immediately had a lot of feelings. I replied right away. So I thought I would share some things that we talk about as though they are really, really obvious, but they are not. And I suspect, and I've encountered this like running a group, working with others, working in kind of like public ritual spaces. A lot of these things are things that we make assumptions about people knowing or having mastery of, but honestly, a lot of people don't, and they're just too embarrassed to ask. So I wanted to compile those things. So in education, we call it the expert blind spot. This is basically something that we've mastered, like as teachers, and it seems really obvious to us, so we don't even bother teaching it, which is why some of these things just aren't in books and aren't in conversation. So here you go. First thing, what the fuck are incense charcoals? Like, this is funny. So if you read intro Wicca books, witchcraft, magical books, a lot of them will talk about burning loose incense or burning resin incense, and they might mention burning it on charcoal. Very rarely does anybody actually explain what that is, what kind of charcoal, how to use it. I want to say Avalon Cameron just made this video. I hope it was Avalon and I'm not just like snubbing someone else. But she just made a video about how to light incense charcoal, so I'll link that below. But funny story, when I was doing the Teen Witch thing, all the books I was reading talked about burning incense on charcoal, and I totally got busted by my dad, like trying to get into his grill stash and take like lumps of charcoal because the books don't tell you what that means. And what they're actually talking about are these charcoal briquettes that come in tubes, and you can get them at New Age stores now, but like at the time, they were carried in smoke shops because this is what they use in hookahs. So you put your smelly shit, your incense, your tobacco or whatever, and it creates a lot of smoke that you can then inhale. So where I was living, you actually needed an ID and to be over 18 to buy these because they're considered a tobacco product, basically, like tobacco paraphernalia. So my 14-year-old ass was trying to light grill charcoal, or even like rummaging through like old fires, like fire pits, because the shit that's left over is called charcoal in many places. And books never told me what they meant. They mean this specialty charcoal briquette that is a lot less accessible than I think we think it is sometimes. So item number one. The second thing is in books, and especially if you go to events or like open rituals, or if you talk to other witches online, some of the language that we use surrounding our experience with gods and spirits and also with energy is really confusing. So I would be, gosh, I think I started going to open rituals when I was about 16 or 17. And I would go to these events, and afterwards there would always be people standing around saying things like, "Oh my God, I could just hear the goddess. Did you see that? I could just hear the voice of the gods." Or "Did you see her appearance?" Like whatever, like the verbs that people would use, like the descriptions they would use. I took them really literally. So when people would talk about hearing a god or seeing a god, like maybe it makes me sound like an idiot now, but I think this is a thing that people do. We take that really literally. Like, if I don't actually like literally hear a voice or see something, does that mean that I'm doing the ritual wrong or I'm not having the full experience? And that was a legit concern of mine when I was a newcomer. And it's something that people express to me all the time in coming to group practice. because so much of us are, like, the words we use to describe our experiences are very sensual. You know, we talk about sight and sound and smell and that kind of thing. And I think the thing that we fail to communicate is that a lot of the times we're not being literal. Now, sometimes people are being literal. There are people out there who do have or claim to have auditory or visual experiences that are like, they do literally see a divine entity or a spirit or whatever. They do literally hear a voice. You know, we have language for that in our magical spaces, and I'm not discounting that. But most people do not mean those things literally. So when they talk about hearing the voice of the goddess, for example, or seeing the god descend upon somebody in you know, a magical ritual or something. Like, I encountered that too. Like, people would claim to have seen the god. And, like, I'm talking about, like, public rituals, especially as a teenager and as a young person watching these. That's the language that was floating around. So I thought that I was, like, magically deficient because I wasn't literally seeing things or hearing voices. So if you feel that way also, please know, overwhelmingly people are not being literal. They're talking about inner experiences. They're talking about, like, not to put fine a point on, like, they're talking about feelings. They're talking about intuition, things that are, like, unverifiable, can't be measured. They're personal experiences. And if you are in a space with such a person and they are using those kinds of words, it doesn't mean that you are broken just because you are not also having those literal experiences. So there's that. Same thing when people talk about energy. I had a really difficult time when I began exploring group work, and particularly when I was solitary. But I bring up group work just because suddenly you're surrounded by people who are all openly talking about their experiences, and if they don't line up with yours, like, it can do something to you. Okay, especially as a newbie. So people do the same thing with energy. Well, they'll talk about feeling energy or seeing energy. And again, like, sometimes people are being really literal. There are people who either can or at least claim to be able to feel energy physically or see it. You know, I've met plenty of folks who will describe energy in terms of light. But what I've discovered over the years is that the majority of people, those experiences are super subjective, and they're actually talking about an inner kind of unverifiable experience. So it's not that they are literally shooting light out of their thame when they cast a circle. And I know some of you are laughing, but, like, this is a thing. So it's not that they're literally shooting light, it's that they are visualizing light coming out of their blade, or they're imagining it or something. Again, like, not everybody, okay, but I think that that kind of nuance doesn't always exist in spaces where newcomers hang out. So it's important to say most people don't mean these sensual, like, sensory kind of experiences literally. When they're talking about seeing energy, feeling energy, hearing things, a lot of that takes place in an internal space. Okay, so again, you're not broken if you can't see, like, so-and-so shooting balls of light out of their fingers or whatever. So there's that. The last thing I wanted to say, again, like, things like this seem obvious, but they're really not. A lot of the times it's just things people need to figure out. And that is this idea that every witch needs an ornate book of shadows. Like, people would talk about books of shadows and they would describe them, and I'm talking about, like, in 101 books. And I'm reading 101 books starting in, like, the late 90s and then, like, through the first decade of the 2000s. And a lot of books, when they would talk about books of shadows, they would talk about, like, you know, your black cover and, like, whatever ribbon dividers you use and leather and, like, parchment. First of all, nobody knows what parchment is. Like, the way people toss that word around, like, it objectively means something in, like, bookbinding spaces, but most of the time when people in pagan communities toss it around, what they really mean is kind of like yellowish paper, you know, that might be kind of expensive. Anyway, you don't need one of these ornate books, and that's not necessarily what a book of shadows would look like. I mean, we've got historical books. I'm thinking about like the early days of witchcraft, and a lot of them are just like shitty, kind of cobbled together, like dime store notebooks. Like, we have some fancy stuff, but a lot of people are just writing on like, you know, like A5 size, whatever, got it down at the corner mart kind of notebooks. So this is my very first book of Shadows, and it is a composition book, and I covered it in green duct tape because I didn't want the kind of the black and white checkered splotchy cover indicating that it was just a shitty composition book. And this is one of the most valuable books that I have, just because it's a record of those early experiences. So like, you don't need to drop a lot of money on a fancy book. You go down to the grocery store and you buy that shitty dollar notebook. Honestly, a lot of those have like better paper in them anyway, and they'll last longer and they won't fall apart. So there's that. It's much more important that you just record stuff somehow rather than it be beautiful. So there's 4 things that seem obvious to me now, but were not obvious to me when I was first getting involved. I hope you all are well. Leave your own experiences in the comments. Like, what do you know now that seems really obvious, but maybe you were afraid to ask about earlier? Or like, what do you find people don't know and are too embarrassed to ask about? Yeah, hope you guys are well.